Good evening, good evening. Hello, 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 everyone. Today is Tuesday, April 26th, 2022. Welcome to another edition of the Beauty in Us Radio right here on Awesome Guide Radio. I'm your host, Nelson E. Brown, and I'm very happy that you all have decided to join me for another show this evening. I'm glad you guys have had the opportunity to hop on for another show. Tonight, we are going to be speaking with District 8 Councilman for the Baltimore City Council, Mr. Kristerfer Burnett, about District 8 and the work that he does in District 8. And so we can become more familiar about how to get involved in our community and how to get involved in um, in our community and in our neighborhoods, and how we can become more active and play a more important role in the change that we want to see. I'm going to read a little bit about the councilman, but before I begin, I want to again thank you all for tuning in. This is the last show of the month of April. We are about to enter into May. So next week on May 3rd, we are going to have another guest. We're going to be starting a new topic for the month of May. So I don't want to reveal too much, but I want you all to get prepared for it. Um, I know that we are still in the middle of an election season, but I wanted the councilman to come on to talk about how important it is to be involved in your community, especially in the neighborhoods that you feel are underrepresented or marginalized. Um, and he's going to speak to us about District 8 and the work that he does in District 8 and why it's so important for us to be involved and why he chose to become a public servant. So I'm going to read a little bit about the councilman um, right now. And for the second half of the show, he's going to talk about the work that he does in his community for District 8 in the City Council from 6:30 to 7. But for now, let's just sit back and learn a little bit about him. I've been speaking with a lot of the legislators locally and throughout the state of Maryland, and I learn about each and every district and each and every community, even the communities outside of the one that I reside in. I know that each community has different needs, and I'm also aware of the fact that, um, in terms of the constituents, it's very critical, it's very imperative for us to meet the needs of the constituents that are supposed to be represented in all of these districts. And again, each and every community is different, and each and every constituent is different. We know about a lot of the neighborhoods that have been underrepresented for decades, for years, and we know about the neighborhoods that receive tons of investments. But again, we have to think about what's best for the community that we serve. So when we think about tonight's discussion, I want to think about it from a holistic approach. Um, I think that again, we need to think about what the needs are in our community, and in District 8 in particular, and not I'm not sure if you guys have noticed, but at the bottom of the ticker, I've included a hashtag for each of the District 8 neighborhoods that the councilman represents. But again, you all are free to look into it more in depth at a later time or during your spare time, but I'm going to read a little bit about the councilman so that we can learn a little bit about District 8 before we speak to him for the second half of the show. Kristerfer Burnett, a lifelong Baltimorean, lives in Southwest Baltimore. He represents the 8th City Council District and represents over 40,000 amazing people across 27 of Baltimore's most diverse neighborhoods. He was elected to serve on the Baltimore City Council in 2016, and in his first term in office, he was appointed to serve as the chair of both City Council's Health Committee and the Legislative Investigations Committee, as well as the vice chair of the Equity and Structure, Public Safety, and Executive Appointments Committees. Additionally, he served as a member of the Housing and Urban Affairs Committee and Education and Youth Committee. He is the co-founder and co-chair of the Baltimore City Human Trafficking Collaborative. Additionally, he also serves as a member on the National Board of Directors of Local Progress and as a member of the Baltimore City Community Schools Task Force, Baltimore City Rec and Parks, Rec 2025 Advisory Committee, and Baltimore City HIV Planning Group and Commission. He also serves on the nonprofit board of directors for the Baltimore City Community Mediation Center and Turnaround Incorporated. He was educated through both the Baltimore City and County public school systems, and he is a graduate of the University of Maryland College Park, where he earned his bachelor's degree in African American Studies with a concentration in public policy He then earned a master's degree in public policy at the University of Maryland, Baltimore County, which is the school I attend right now, and then I'm getting ready to graduate from this fall. So again, that was a little bit about him. And he also says that he truly believes that the most fulfilling aspects of his life have been giving back to those who need it and advocating for structural reforms to improve the lives of Baltimoreans and empowering the residents of Baltimore to be change makers in order to move the city forward. Now, that was a little bit about our councilman. But again, we want to learn a little bit more about how this process works. We want to learn more about what it's like to represent a city, the city of Baltimore, and the surrounding counties. And like I stated before, each and every community is different. Each and every constituent is different. Each and every councilman or councilwoman is different. It's our part as a community to make sure that we work with our legislators in order to develop priorities and to outline priorities that we wish to tackle. So, if we learn a little bit about the legislative process for the city of Baltimore, we can learn about how a bill is passed and how it's introduced and how it's read and how it's considered and so forth. So, a part of the legislative process, according to BaltimoreCityCouncil.com, it says that a bill is submitted by a council member for introduction to the city council. So that's the first step. And the next step is reading the bill, the first reading. Each bill is given a number by the executive secretary to the council and assigned to a committee. And the bill number and title are read at the council meeting, and the president assigns the bill to the appropriate committee or committees for study, and much of the work of the council is done in committees and subcommittees, and committees are established at the first council meeting of each term. And the president assigns each bill that is not immediately adopted to an appropriate committee or subcommittee. A copy of the bill is also sent to the appropriate city's agency. Each agency issues a written report on the bill, and these reports are forwarded to the executive secretary and the committee assigned to study the bill. So again, just to recap, we're talking about how the legislative process works within the city of Baltimore. And again, the councilman's going to talk about this more in detail in terms of how he does it for District 8. But I want people to really, really look into this. I really want people to think about how they could give back to their community and how they can become more involved in this process, because we are the power. We are in the position to voice our concerns and register our concerns to our legislators, because all of them work for us and all of them are supposed to act on our behalf. So, if we think about all of the committees that the legislative work where or under, I should say, or it's carried out by 6 standing committees and other select committees or subcommittees that do this work, we can think about the members of the committee who work together in order to make this happen. Okay, so the first committee that's a part of the city council, according to my research, is Economic and Community Development. The second committee is called the Education, Workforce, and Youth Committee. The third committee is called the Health, Environment, and Technology. And Public Safety and Government Operations is the fourth. Rules and Legislative Oversight is the fifth. And the last one is Ways and Means. So these are the committees that make up the city council for the city of Baltimore. But again, I talked about the introduction and I talked about how the bill is read. And in terms of the committee consideration, that's the next step that we're going to talk about a little bit. And again, this just gives us an idea of what to expect when we go to our legislators and if we voice our concerns and when we register our ideas or our suggestions to whatever it is that they want to propose or whatever type of bill or piece of legislation that they do want to bring to council. We have the ability to do that. We have the ability to come together and voice our concerns. So in terms of committee consideration, generally a committee will hold a public hearing after all reports are received from the agencies, and the legislation may be heard more quickly if requested by the committee chair and approved by the body. And hearings are generally held in the council chambers unless otherwise noted. And hearings are also open to the public, and generally public testimony will be heard in committee hearings. And public testimony is not heard during meetings of the full city council. So again, The hearings can be open to the public. So that in and of itself lets us know that, we have a say, we have a voice in this process. It's not just about who represents us, it's about how we represent ourselves within our communities. It's about how we give back and how we make the difference and be that change agent that we want to see. In sociology, I often learn about the social dimensions, the social determinants of health. And the social determinants of health, I've been studying that for a long time, ever since I started studying sociology in college, and ever since I've been a part of the UMBC community, I've had a chance to study the social determinants of health. And I think that the social determinants of health applies to this type of conversation that we're having about not only District 8 within the city of Baltimore, but also what it looks like to give back to the community and what it looks like to have a community that is thriving and not just surviving, thriving and not just surviving. I think it's important for us to note that the social determinants of health definitely give us an idea of what kind of community that we're walking into. The social determinants of health can definitely represent the economic and social conditions that influence individuals and groups, and in terms of the differences in the health status, and that there are health promoting factors found in each person's um, living and working conditions. So, income, wealth, influence, and power or authority are examples. And other risk factors from each individual could include behavioral risk factors or genetics that influence the risk of a disease or vulnerability to a disease or injury. And this is in reference to our health and wellness and what the health related disparities are. And I think that the COVID-19 pandemic has definitely taught us about the social dimensions of health and what those look like and how important it is for each community, especially the communities that are marginalized, to really, really take seriously. So when we talk about the social dimensions of health, we can also think about what the World Health Organization says about that. So the World Health, according to the World Health Organization, in terms of us talking about this discussion, in terms of us having this discussion about our community and what it looks like to be active and involved, and what it looks like when, excuse me, when you work as a legislator or when you are living and working in the community as a constituent. The World Health Organization says that this unequal distribution of health damaging experiences is not in any sense a natural phenomenon, but is the result of a toxic combination of poor social policies, unfair economic arrangements, where the already well off and healthy become even richer, and the poor, who are already more likely to be ill, become even poorer, and bad politics. And many of the issues that are of a particular focus are of the social determinants of health can definitely stem from poverty. So poverty is something that I don't think I've had a chance to have for a conversation on this show, and I think that I may need to sit down with a new guest to talk about what it looks like to be impoverished or what it feels like to be impoverished when we talk about the social dimensions of health and what that looks like and what that feels like. Um, I think that the United States Centers for Disease Control and Prevention is definitely um, a good resource to use when we talk about when we have this conversation and when we think about this from a holistic approach. And the CDC helps define the social determinants of health as life enhancing resources such as food supply, housing, economic and social relationships, transportation, education, and healthcare, and whose distribution across populations effectively determines length and the quality of life. And these could include access to care and resources such as insurance coverage, income, housing, food, and transportation. And the social determinants of health, according to the CDC, influence health promoting behaviors, like we discussed, and health equity among the population. And it helps determine whether or not it's possible and without equitable distribution of social determinants among groups. So the list of the social determinants of health can go on for a long time, but when we have a conversation about what it looks like and what it feels like to be a part of a community, we have to think about what the social determinants of health are. So whenever we talk about subjects that are related to education, public safety, housing, affordable housing, healthcare, family sustaining wage earnings. When we have conversations about these things, we have to think about it from a holistic approach, and we have to think about it from a constituent's point of view. I know oftentimes there are communities that have been marginalized for decades at a time. And I think that a lot of people know that, but a lot of people have kind of turned a deaf ear to many of the disparities that are prevalent in our communities today. So I think that the COVID-19 pandemic has, in some ways, exacerbated what those health related disparities are between each community of color. So I think that, yes, good evening, good evening, good evening. I have some people tuning in from Facebook and other streaming channels. Just in case you're listening for the first time, I'm Nelson Brown. This is the Beauty in Us Radio right here on Awesome God Radio. We're having a conversation about the social determinants of health and what it looks like and feels like to be a part of the community that you live and work in. And we are going to have Councilman Kristerfer Burnett on from 6:30 to 7 to talk about the work that he does in the city of Baltimore in the council representing District 8. But when we talk about the social determinants of health and when we talk about what it looks like, to really, really think about education, public safety, healthcare, transportation, affordable housing, how each of those go hand in hand. And I think that, again, when we talk about the impoverished communities that have been marginalized for decades at a time, we have to think about why that's the case. We have to think about why there are so many communities that aren't receiving the investments that they deserve and that are needed. There are tons of people. Well, I know for a fact that there are a lot of my classmates, so a lot of my peers, some of the other sociology students like myself, we're all interested in pursuing an education, furthering our education, and building our careers. A lot of us are interested in becoming homeowners. A lot of us are interested in, again, learning about, because I live, in Baltimore County, but I do have a lot of peers that I work with, and that I've attended classes with, and that I've sat down with and spoken with. A lot of us have a desire to, again, be that change that we want to see. We come together and we use our creative muscles to our advantage to figure out how we can make a difference in our communities, because we realize that our ideas matter and that our voices matter. So I live in county, and I work in the healthcare industry, and I've been able to network with a lot of sociology students that who have a concentration in the field of healthcare. And even though the sociology covers many disciplines and it's very abstract, I think that once we figure out what the focus is, and in this case, and what I'm referring to, when we talk about healthcare, we can think about that in every aspect. But when we talk about public safety, when we speak about education, when we speak about affordable housing, when we speak about our senior citizens, and when we speak about transportation and many of these things, we have to think about the social determinants of health. Those cover every area in SDOH, the social determinants of health. But the World Health Organization can definitely give us a lot of facts in terms of what the health related disparities are by race and by gender. Um, Many examples can include the fact that race and health often refer to how being identified with a specific race influences health. So I've learned a lot about that as I continue to study trends in the healthcare industry, and as I continue to study sociology. I learned a lot about the correlation between the health-related disparities that do exist and race, especially throughout the course of the pandemic. And even though race is a very complex concept that has changed in many different eras and depends on both the social recognition and how people identify themselves. In this type of study, a lot of scientists organize people in racial categories, and depending on how what they've experienced and what the health research says, the differences in the health status, the health outcomes, and the life expectancy, and many other indicators of health in different ethnic groups and racial groups can definitely be well documented. So that these are just a few examples of what it looks like to actually be involved in your community and to think about what is going on and why the disparities exist. And these are some of the things that I've been able to study as a sociology student at UMBC. A lot of our professors have taught us about this, and we've had a conversation about what it looks like to, again, close that gap between the marginalized communities and the communities that are, wealthy, so to speak, and what it looks like in terms of why the health-related disparities exist between the low-income communities or between the communities of color, and what we can do in order to close that gap and rebuild and provide the investments that are necessary in order to move our communities forward. Because we're so rich in culture, and we are in a position to do so much. A lot of us are very, very gifted and talented in so many ways. A lot of us are in the position to use our gifts to assist others, and we're in the position to, again, be that change that we want to see. But it's all in how you use that gift. It's not just about fulfilling ourselves or using our gifts in order to get to where we want to be. It's also important to reach back and provide the helping hand to the people who really, really need that. So these are just some of the things to think about when we talk about the social determinants of health, what it looks like to be involved in your community. And again, I think that the COVID-19 pandemic has forced us to think about what really matters, and in terms of what the needs are and not just the wants. Because what we wanted for a long time is not what we've needed, what we have needed. And I think that the pandemic has taught us that in many ways. It's not just about, again, going after what you want, but remembering the things that matter. We've all been in a position where we've had to be pushed into a very uncomfortable space. A lot of us around this time 2 years ago, we didn't know what the world was going to look like. Everything was at a complete halt. Everything was shut down. And a lot of us didn't know how we were going to move forward. A lot of the communities, not just here in Maryland or in the city of Baltimore, but around the world, they didn't know how to move forward. Think about how many people lost their jobs throughout the course of the pandemic. Think about a lot of families that continue to struggle throughout the course of the pandemic. And all of the families that may not have had food on their tables or roofs over their heads. A lot of people who may have gotten evicted from their homes because they weren't able to afford some of the basic necessities and the expenses that come with them. All of these things are things that I think about when I study sociology and when I look at how social status, income, race, education, all those factors, all of those things make up how we live our lives. They play a role in terms of that fact. All of that factors into how we live our lives and how we perceive ourselves and how we move and groove every day. So health disparities, and I keep talking about health disparities because I think that applies to each and every area of our lives, no matter who you are or how you identify yourself. Health disparities, sources say, are preventable differences in the burden of disease, injury, violence, or opportunities to achieve optimal health that are experienced by socially disadvantaged populations. And according to the CDC, they are intrinsically related to the historical and current unequal distribution of social, political, economic, and environmental resources. So those are the things that I've just discussed with you all. And these are the types of disparities that we are trying to get rid of. And we have to think about it again from a holistic approach. And it's not going to change overnight. So when we talk to the councilman, in about 5 minutes, we'll have a chance to really, really talk about District 8 in particular, and talk about how diverse each and every neighborhood is and each and every community is. So, without further ado, since he's on, I'm going to introduce you all to the Baltimore City Councilman for District 8, Councilman Kristerfer Burnett. I'm very excited that he has agreed to hop on the show and talk a little bit about the work that he does for District 8 and the work that he does in the city of Baltimore. Now, Councilman, I've definitely been able to, I've been following your work for a while. I've talked to a lot of your colleagues, and I've learned a lot about the city of Baltimore through all of your colleagues that you've worked with in the council. And I've also, through my peers, on campus at UMBC, I've had a chance to work with a lot of nonprofit organizations and a lot of students who work as liaisons and assistants for people who are in public office, about what the legislative process looks like and what it looks like to work with your legislators on a lot of issues that matter. A lot of people don't realize how impactful their voices are as constituents. And as a young person working with a lot of my peers, I've become very active, and I played a very active role in reaching out to my legislators and voicing my concerns about issues that I think are important. So could you tell us a little bit about yourself and what made you decide to want to run to represent District 8 in the City Council?
Thank you for that, and thank you for the opportunity to come on your show. I definitely appreciate the opportunity to connect with the folks that tune in and my constituents across the city of Baltimore. And so I ran for office. I'm in my second term on the city council. I was originally elected in 2016. But before that, I was a community organizer and had done that work for about a decade as a student at the University of Maryland College Park, and continued to be more civically engaged at UMBC as well. I got my master's degree in public policy, but then just doing work in community. I served on the board of my local community association for a few years. I used to run a farmer's market. I did advocacy on a number of issues before the Baltimore City Council and in Annapolis in the General Assembly, or whether that was around school funding, affordable housing, police reform, were all issues that I was already engaged in. And to be honest, it was the community that, and through that advocacy work, community folks that really started to put the bug in my ear to consider public office. I wanted to work in policy. I do have my academic background is in public policy, but running for office wasn't necessarily in the cards. But when you're doing the work, when you're on the ground, people notice. And it was through that engagement work that I was doing in my community that led to consideration of public office and taking a shot. I wasn't sure I was going to win in 2016. I was a first-time candidate, first-time running, and relatively new to the world of Baltimore politics. But I for a lot of people, it was the track record of community work that I think propelled me into a successful campaign and getting the stamp of approval for my voters in 2016, and then again in 2020 when I ran it again for re-election. So something I don't take lightly at all, to have that confidence from folks here in Southwest and Northwest Baltimore that believe that I'm a good representative for the issues that they care about.
Yes, absolutely. And I can definitely attest to that. I see you on social media. You're everywhere. Like you're everywhere. You're very involved. Like, you don't miss a beat of anything. You're a part of every event. And I see you out there working all the time. I definitely see that all the time. And that's very important for people to realize, because a lot of people again, like I stated before, they don't realize how impactful their voices are. And a lot of people, I always encourage people to really, really dig deep and do their research and think about what they're passionate about, and how they can come together with people who have that same creative mindset that they have, in order to figure out how they can use their gifts to give back and help others. Because all of us are gifted in some way or another, but we just have to figure out how to use that creative muscle to our advantage in order to serve the people that are in our communities. It's very important to reach back and help people, in our communities. A lot of people just use their gifts in order to fulfill themselves or in order to get to where they want to be, but they forget about how important it is to reach back and help others, because we've all needed someone to lift us up, and it's our responsibility to do the same for people who are coming after us. So how have you been able to navigate throughout the course of the COVID-19 pandemic? Now, I know a lot of your colleagues that I've spoken with, and a lot of people at UMBC, because I study sociology at UMBC, and I've been able to work with a lot of people who run nonprofit organizations and a lot of people who have um, played an active role throughout the course of the pandemic um, in the community in terms of different giveaways, volunteering in different arenas, whether it's giving away school supplies, feeding the homeless, helping the children in school, getting access to the internet. I mean, a wide variety of things. So how have you been able to navigate throughout the course of the pandemic? Because it's pushed a lot of us into a very, very uncomfortable space in terms of how we move about our daily lives and how we still serve. How we've had to change the way we serve our community and the way we serve the people who we represent, or people who look to us for a lot of resources.
Yeah, I mean the last 2 years have been a challenge, I think, for all of us. A lot of grief, a lot of trauma, through loss of life and illness, loss of the economic impacts of the pandemic. It's been a lot for people. It's been a lot for my own family and myself. Trying to stay safe and keep my family safe. But yeah, the last 2 years, I mean, from as an elected representative, we no one really saw this thing coming. It was just seemed like an ordinary March. I guess a little over 2 years ago, just like any other spring, and planning. At that point, I was working a lot on some campaign finance reform bills and some other things that right now seem like small potatoes in the greater scheme of how the world has changed in the last 2 years. But as far as how I made it, I mean, it was a challenge. I mean, I was immediately appointed to the city's response team. Particularly, there was a division that was created to focus on communication and messaging, so that we could ensure that people were following all of the guidelines, which, as you recall, were changing seemingly every day. It was wear a mask, don't wear a mask, how far apart are we supposed to stand, how is this disease travel, are we supposed to wipe things down, it was a lot. And so part of my job in the beginning of the pandemic became, how do I communicate to my constituents the public health messaging that was very critical, as this was the first pandemic that almost all of us had experienced, many of us had experienced. And so a lot of, combating misinformation or information that was rapidly changing. And so I was and making sure that people could understand it, whether the messaging was culturally appropriate in multiple languages, and how were we able to reach people, and how are we getting in touch with people. And so the first few months of the pandemic, was pretty much, I had 3 to 4 meetings a day starting at 6 a.m. that was all COVID response only, on top of the other work that you do in your district every day, whether that's illegal dumping or public safety or schools. And so it became a pretty big lift in the beginning of the pandemic to both balance my own personal safety, my family safety, and the safety of my constituents. So it was the public health messaging obviously became incredibly important to make sure people were staying safe. But then what became also very apparent in this pandemic is things that we already knew, right? So suddenly kids had to go home from school, and we didn't have enough laptops. We didn't have enough internet access, or quality internet access, or people couldn't afford it. People were losing their jobs and needed unemployment insurance. And so the dynamics in my office changed very quickly. And we started to work on things that we hadn't worked on before. So one of the things that was very apparent was this digital divide that became very obvious for young people in Baltimore City. And so I teamed up with a few of my colleagues to start pushing back on rate increases that Comcast and other large companies were leveraging to, in my opinion, take advantage of the situation. to helping to fundraise in collaboration with Baltimore City Schools and Mayor Scott's office to make sure we got laptops and those sort of portable internet devices. I'm blanking on the name of them, but to make sure that kids could, quickly adjust to the digital learning space. And then the food access, right? That became also very apparent for people, is that, with the loss of income, loss of jobs, meant that people were struggling to find food and how to eat. And so we were working with the Maryland Food Bank to make sure we were standing up partners in my district and across the city that could do food distribution. And I really just want to take the time to thank all of the churches and community-based organizations that immediately answered the call to serve as food distribution sites and continue to this day. Still Meadow Community Fellowship Church, the Allendale Neighborhood Association, St. Bartholomew's Church, Hunting Ridge Presbyterian, St. Bernardine. I know I'm forgetting a couple. St. Jennifer Church of Christ. I mean, all up and down the Evanston Avenue corridor, Frederick Avenue corridor, up into Howard Park area. Faith-based institutions were immediately answering the call and trying to meet the needs of people who needed the help the most. And I would flag that, while we had to respond in an emergency crisis, it became clear that, look, we were saying that people were dealing with this stuff way before the pandemic, but it became front and center that a lot of folks were really struggling. And so the pandemic really shifted how we were working as an office, the things that we were working on as a city, the things that we needed to really advocate for. And so, yeah, my political agenda shifted pretty dramatically in the last 2 years. And we're finally seemingly heading towards some level of return or normalcy, though, I'd still advise people to take all the proper precautions because this thing is not over. But things seem to be getting a little bit better. But I think it also gave us some marching orders that, people are really living on a shoestring budget. Our young people really do need the technology and assets to be able to thrive in a virtual space, in a digital space. But also, this is where things are headed with tech in general. I mean, you and I would probably have been in the studio at some point, but here we are on a digital platform doing this interview. And so things are changing a lot in the last 2 years. And I think as government officials, we have to make sure that we're adjusting and rolling with the punches and meeting the needs of the community as they arise.
Yes, and it's wonderful, and I'm glad you had the opportunity to serve, and you were able to get the help from so many churches and so many community members, because it's not just one person's responsibility; it's all of our responsibilities in order to help each other. A lot of people just think that it's up to one person to make all of these decisions, and it's up to one person to make this change, but that's not true. It's everybody's responsibility to make sure that we all work together, for our community members, because, we all, need each other. And, the fact that you've been able to work with so many churches and so many community organizers, it's been great. And you've been able to make an impact in the lives of so many individuals and families, throughout, your neighborhood and throughout the city of Baltimore. And you've still been able to make those connections, even with all of the obstacles that have been in your way. So my next question is, what are some of the things that you accomplished last year? I know that you're a part of several committees, and I know that you still have some items on your agenda for the remainder of the year. So I know that 2020 was definitely a challenging year. Last year, we had an opportunity to bounce back a little bit, but the pandemic was still a huge distraction, and it still prevented us from, moving the way we wanted to move. We got back to some sense of normalcy. Some restrictions were lifted, but we were still facing a lot of bumps in the road. So what are some of the things that you were able to accomplish in the city council last year and up until this point?
Sorry, I couldn't unmute myself. Okay. You think 2 years in, I would have gotten good at that. So I'd say the thing I was most proud of in the last term or last year. Well, let me step back just to add some context. So one of the issues that I have a mentor that works in politics, and he reached out to me and said, Councilman, the one thing I want to make sure that stays on your radar is that anytime there's these crises that occur, at any point, you need to make sure that, as these federal dollars come in to communities and to the city of Baltimore, in that time it was the CARES Act dollars that were coming, that we don't get left behind. And by we, he meant, black and brown business owners, minority and women-owned businesses, that, making sure that they get opportunities. And so one of the things that we saw during the beginning of the pandemic was that there was this, and you recall this, there was a need for a shortage for PPE. We could not figure out where to get masks, where to get gloves. All of these materials were needed very quickly. And anytime there's a declared state of emergency, the procurement process, which is like the contracting process or the process in which a business can do business with the government, there is a relaxing of the rules as it relates to how to be able to move quickly. So it's not necessarily a bad thing. It just means that, hey, there's a crisis at hand. We need to be able to move expeditiously. Well, one of those rules that is relaxed is a vetting to ensure that minority and women-owned businesses are, anytime, like say you say, hey, we're trying to find somebody that can give us 100,000 masks. There may be an MBE, which is a minority business enterprise, that can do that, but sometimes you got to seek them out. They may not have the same level of resources or marketing to or existing contracts with the city to be engaged. And so there was concerns early on that minority and women-owned businesses would be left behind as all of these dollars start flying around. And so he said, keep your eyes on that. And I absolutely did. And so I remember it was February 2021. We had a briefing on the budget and where things were, which wasn't really good, as you can imagine. We had a huge deficit. But I started asking about contracting. And at that point, we were still, sort of compiling data. And I said, look, I'm going to come back and figure this out, but I want to know what the breakdown is between MBEs and non-MBEs by category for these things that are being procured during this emergency crisis. And what became very evident was that just what we feared, minority, black and brown businesses, women-owned businesses were being left behind for sake of being expeditious. And so I put in a emergency bill to ensure that loophole was closed. So if we are going to be doing procurement during a crisis, you cannot overlook MBEs in that process, no matter how quickly we need to move. And that didn't immediately wipe out all of the disparities at that point, but it's one of the bills I was most proud of in the last year, that we could really try and close that loophole. I have another bill that's currently in the council this year, but I introduced it last year, but sometimes the process takes a while to move, that would further close those loopholes as it relates to procurement process. So this would ensure that anytime a city agency is trying to get a waiver, meaning that they're saying, hey, nobody makes this thing that's whatever that widget is or product is. There's no MBEs in Baltimore that do this. So we'd like to get a waiver to be able to go with the bigger company. What it does is it triggers a market study that has to happen. So we're not just relying on the agency's word or the staff's word, but that they have to actually produce a study showing that they've done a financial analysis of the city of Baltimore, of all of the industry, folks in that industry, to be able to ensure that we are not leaving people behind. I have full confidence we'll be able to pass the bill. There were just some logistical items that we're still trying to work through with that change. And so those are the things that when I think about, responding to the pandemic, but, and still ensuring that folks aren't, my communities aren't left behind. I think that was the thing that I was most proud of was passing the emergency procurement legislation.
Yes, well, that's good. It's good that you've still been able to make an impact, and you were able to again recognize something that was very imperative. Minority and women-owned businesses, serving the Black and Brown community, individuals within the communities that you represent is very important. And I'm glad you had an opportunity to do that because again, a lot of people, were left behind, like you said, and a lot of people who have been marginalized in these communities for so long, they weren't receiving the recognition and the resources that they needed. So it's really great that you had the chance to do that. How have your constituents been now since, the pandemic it appears as though it's coming to a close and there's like you stated, people are getting accustomed to some sense of the new norm. And I know that the city hall just opened back up recently. So uh, how can your constituents be a part of the process in terms of how they can voice their concerns to their councilmen, or not just you, but just whoever represents them? How are they in the position to voice their or register their concerns about issues that are prevalent in their neighborhoods, or things that are important to them that they feel like have been ignored for so long? Because I do know that people, we all do have a voice, and we are all in a position to register our concerns to our councilmen and to our state representatives and people who are elected to represent us in general. But how can they get involved and become a I guess participate in the process, because a lot of people don't really know how to really do their research in order to figure out what the issues are and how to fix them. So how can they be a part of the process a little bit more, with the information that you guys give?
So a couple of things I always recommend. If you go to BaltimoreCityCouncil.com, there's a little button you can click on that says City Council Lookup. You can just type in your address, and it'll give you who your council member is and how to get in touch with them. City Hall is reopened, though I would note that most of us are still doing meetings virtually and engaging in a virtual space. City Hall is not a very big building. The offices are super tiny, so for safety, at least in my office, we're not doing in-person meetings. But I'll meet people outside. I'll meet them in a safer space than my little tiny office in the building. But people, we remain as accessible as we can. Either calling. The best way to get me directly is email. But calling is a good way, as long as you leave a voicemail, because we're in and out of the office. I don't have a big team. None of us have a big staff. We usually have 2 or 3 people that are working with us. And so it's hard to sort of man the phones around the clock. So we always tell people, if you do call, leave a message. We do not have caller ID in City Hall. I know it is 2022, but I won't know you called if we are not there. So leave a voicemail. We'll follow back up. We usually get we get an email when you leave a voicemail. So it's pretty easy for us to do that if we can't get it in real time. But yeah, I mean, I would always tell people to just reach out, whether it's just shooting an email. I get people all the time that just say, hey, I want to know what's going on. Can you add me to your email list? We have a newsletter. I try to remain, as you mentioned earlier, very active on social media. Because I know everybody's, well, not everyone, but a lot of people are on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, or Nextdoor, and so we try to use as many platforms as we can to communicate what's going on and how to get in touch. The council hearings are also a great way to get involved, and you can view the calendar on BaltimoreCityCouncil.com to see what bills are being heard or what legislation is being considered. Charm TV is a great tool. That's local channel 25 if you live in Baltimore City, but it's also on YouTube. If you go on YouTube, there's a Charm TV citizens portal where you can watch hearings probably over the last decade. I want to say you can probably scroll back and find different topics, different issues that have been covered by the council. And yeah, I would say that's usually what I tell people. If anybody's listening and wants to reach out, we also do a District 8 Community Academy where I teach or bring in folks to teach different topics. So I do a Civics 101 class, and we record all of them. So if somebody missed it and say, hey, I want to watch the civics class, they can just email me. I'll send them the link. And we break down how city government works and what the legislative process is, so that people have a better understanding and are empowered to better advocate for issues they care about, and to better hold folks accountable. Because if you don't know what I'm supposed to be doing all day, then it's hard to really judge if I'm good at it or not, or effectively representing on the issues that people care about. And so that's, I tell people all the time, when, a lot of times they really only engage with their elected officials during an election year. And that's usually because that's when we're probably knocking on doors or had the time to knock on doors. But citizens have a role too in between election years, as do elected officials, to make connections and to be informed and be a part of the process. And so I remember I was at the polls in the 2020 election, and the guy said, "How come I only see you in an election year?" And I said, "Well, because how come I only see you in an election year? I'm at your community meetings all the time." We were standing right in front of the building where the meetings are. And I was like, "I've never seen you at this association." And he's like, "Well, I can't, I need to start coming." I'm like, "Right, because I'm here every month. If I'm not here, remember my staff is here. We try to be as engaged. Actually, as soon as we're done here, I got a meeting tonight at 7:00 with one of my community groups. I think it's getting involved, whether it's your neighborhood association or with your church, volunteering at schools. Like, we all have a part to play in making our city better. I tell people, nobody can do everything, but everybody can do something. And if we all contribute, we'll have a better city. But working with your elected officials is a great way to get things done, as is just generally getting involved and making some impact in your own community.
Yes, absolutely. So before I wrap up the show, I wanted to ask you, what advice would you give to young people like myself? Because, like I said, I study sociology at UMBC. I'm getting ready to graduate in the fall. Um, After being in college for 5 years and really studying sociology, and I've had the chance to study it because it's very abstract, and there are so many dimensions that many of my peers and I have gone into in terms of learning about that. Because some of my friends and my peers are pursuing careers in law. Some of them are pursuing careers in public policy. Some who work and are studying, for careers in the healthcare industry, like me. We're networking with many people in that regard. So, what advice would you give to young people who are interested in working in public policy or becoming a public servant? I know some of my peers are even working as liaisons for some of their elected officials, and they're learning more about the legislative process. So, what advice would you give to young people who are in college like me, or young people who want to pursue this, but they don't really know the ins and outs of what it takes in order to be successful at you know you know not just campaigning, but also just playing an active role constantly, because this is not just a one-time thing. This is ongoing. You have to be a part of the process all the time, and you have to be as flexible as possible with your constituents and with your staff. And you have to wear many hats. And a lot of young people, they don't really know the ins and outs of it. So what advice would you give to them?
So yeah, when I was a student at UMBC, I was involved in the GSA, Graduate Student Association, and when I was an undergraduate at College Park, same thing. I was active in campus politics, campus life, and the surrounding community. And so a lot of times as students, I know obviously you have a lot of studying, a lot of work to do, but whether it's again sort of getting involved in the campus community, getting involved in the surrounding community, I think is a big deal. As far as how to make inroads into the policy side, I think it's watching hearings, showing up to testify. I gave my first set of testimony, I want to say back in like maybe 2010, 2009 was the first time I showed up in City Hall. That was almost 6 years, 7 years before I ran for office. And so, because for me, a lot of times people want to run for office, but don't necessarily understand. There's a lot of people who run for office who don't really understand how politics works or understand the policymaking process. And so I think as much as you become a student of whatever your degree is in, you have to also become a policy student. And so much of it's following what's happening in Baltimore City Hall, but I look at things that are all across the country all the time. I'm on the board of directors for an organization called Local Progress, which is a national organization of local officials, and we do we're almost like a think tank, but we also provide training for progressive elected officials, and capacity building, but also just best practices. And so I can call them and say, hey, I want to work on this issue of minority and women-owned business contracting. Can you let me know what are some of the best practices from across the country? What are people working on? And so I read a lot of policy guides. I engage in with not only local progress, but Maryland Association of Counties, National League of Cities. I read a ton of news, whether it's local or statewide, to just follow, political news, not just like CNN and like what Congress is up to, but I want to know what they're talking about in Frederick County. What are they talking about in Columbia? What bills are they working on in the DC City Council or in Philadelphia or New York or Seattle? Just again, because anything you put in Baltimore, people have. There's usually not many items that an elected official is coming up with in 2022 that probably hasn't been tried or talked about somewhere else. And so I do read a lot of policy books, and I did enjoy sociology classes as well. Understanding the conditions that people live in and talking to community is a great way to come up with policy recommendations, because you don't want to do policy making in silos. You don't want to just work hey, I got this great idea, but and how to fix our transit system, but you haven't talked to anybody that rides the bus, right? So I think tapping into people's lived experiences is a great way to better understand what needs to be done on the policymaking side, but also just looking at what people are doing across the country. As much as Baltimore is a very unique place, there's a lot of the same struggles exist in urban centers or similarly sized cities are everywhere. And so I try to and still remain a student of public policy every single day to learn what's going on, what are people up to, how are they trying to solve these challenges, how are they approaching problems. And sometimes you can't, most of the time you're not going to be able to copy paste the bill from some other city, but it can give you some framework. And so I've actually been working with, it's funny you mentioned the students, is I've been working with a group of students that are law students, third-year law students, that are helping me with a white paper on the issue of facial recognition technology and some of the algorithmic bias that exists in that. And last year, actually, one of the bills I forgot to mention that I was proud of is I passed a moratorium on the use of this technology because of the racial bias embedded in the code. But that moratorium ends this December. So I'm actually working on a comprehensive bill to better regulate and address the issue, and working with students just like yourself right now to help me with research, background data, and compiling a white paper that we're going to use to educate the rest of the council on this issue. And so I think, to directly answer how people can get involved, I think that, whether it's requesting internships or reaching out and, hey, I'm a fellow, I'm looking, I'm doing a paper on this thing. Can you ask me, asking questions? I do that all the time with young people who reach out and say, hey, I'm working on a research paper for my capstone project. I heard you did something on food access or whatever the topic is. Would you mind sitting down with me for an interview and answering some questions? And I try to, as long as my schedule allows, I do try to make myself available, because at one point I was in their seat as a student, trying to learn and better understand what's going on. And so I try to get back, because young people are the future. They're the now, right? Not even the future, right now. And it's important that we continue to grow that next generation of political leaders, whether they are politicians themselves or just want to enter careers as a policy analyst or a government relations staffer or a lobbyist, right? Lobbying doesn't necessarily mean you're always doing bad stuff. I work with lobbyists that work on affordable housing or worker pay issues or labor issues, right? So there's a number of ways that you can engage that people can get involved in the political sphere. There's a lot of work, and we need smart people that want to do the job and make people's lives better here in Baltimore.
Well, thanks again for agreeing to appear on my show. I enjoyed listening to you and learning more about District 8. I'm glad you had a chance to speak to the listeners and to me about how do you go about this process and what goes into being a council member and what it looks like to represent so many constituents. I'm glad that you've had an opportunity to make a difference. This is your second term, and you've already done so much. So that's really, really great. And I'm going to let you go, but I just wanted to thank you for taking time out to appear on the broadcast.
I appreciate the invite, and looking forward to coming on sometime in the future.
Yes. Take care. Thank you again.
Have a good one. Bye.
You too. So that wraps up another edition of the Beauty in Us Radio right here on Awesome God Radio. I hope you guys had a chance to really, really listen to the councilman and learn more about District 8 and the Baltimore City Council. We are in election season, but like the councilman mentioned, you have to be involved 24/7, and it's really important to work with your legislators on issues that matter. So I encourage you all to, again, do your research and really, really, really sit down with your legislators in these hearings, and sometimes even with them directly, and speak to them about issues that you're concerned about, because your voice matters. Everyone works for you, and you are the power. We as constituents, we have a voice, and we have the power to make a difference. And I hope that was relayed to you all this evening. So next week we are going to have Mr. Jerry Royce Live and Ms. Paula G. Voice with us to talk about their work in the broadcast journalism field. So they're going to be speaking with us next week. And Ms. Paula is going to talk to us about her work as a broadcast journalist and as a TV and radio personality, print model, blogger, and writer for Flourish Digital Magazine. So Ms. Paula is definitely going to educate us about the field of journalism. And Mr. Jerry Royce Live has been on this show before, and it'll be really exciting to touch base with him and Miss Paula to see what they're doing and to see what projects they're working on for 2022 and for the remainder of the year. So this is Nelson E. Brown, the host of the Beauty in Us Radio, right here on Awesome God Radio. Make sure that you guys download the Awesome God Radio app. Go to awesomegodradio.com. Make sure you follow us on YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and all of the social media outlets. And make sure you follow me on social media at Nelson E. Brown on Instagram and Twitter, and at Nelson Brown on LinkedIn, Facebook, Twitch, and all of the other outlets. Thanks again, and I look forward to seeing you guys next week. So make an appointment to meet me back here on May 3rd, Tuesday, May 3rd at 6 p.m. for another show. I love you guys, and I appreciate you guys, and I will see you next week. Bye.